The following is a podcast of an article about C.S. Lewis, which appears on the C.S. Lewis Institute website, www.cslewisinstitute.org. The title of this lecture is The Prayer Life of C.S. Lewis. It was written by Dr. James M. Houston. Dr. Houston, Emeritus Professor of Spiritual Theology at Regent University, Vancouver, was a personal friend and colleague of Lewis at Oxford. This essay is read by Richard Leonard.
Prayer, perhaps more than anything else, is a true test of a Christian's devotion and intimacy with God. Its presence in a Christian's life says it all. Its absence is the evidence of a merely theoretical framework of faith. So to try to enter into the understanding of Lewis's prayer life is an attempt to penetrate his very mind and spirit in the most intimate way. Can we do so without presumption? Is it speculative to try to do so? I knew Lewis personally, enough to have a clear impression of his personal faith in the years between 1946 and 1953, when we met in a group discussion that was held in the home that I shared with Nicholas Zernoff during those years. Zernoff was then leader of the Society of St. Albans and St. Sergius. It was through him that I got to know Lewis. While he was a witty raconteur and provocative debater, Lewis was essentially shy about his inner life, so it would be an impossible task to describe his prayer life unless he had written significantly about prayer. But he made a substantial contribution to the theology of prayer. His last work, published posthumously, Letters to Malcolm, he completed in April 1963, just 7 months before his death. It deals frankly with issues that he faced privately in prayer. His Reflections on the Psalms, published 2 years earlier, deal with his personal difficulties in reading the Psalms, and also his appreciation of the Christian liturgy of the Psalter. But Lewis was never enthusiastic about his own church life, which, in the setting of a college chapel, was atypical of parish life. So his own focus upon prayer was more personal than corporate. Several of his essays, notably Work and Prayer and the Efficacy of Prayer, challenge us with specific issues of personal prayer. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and the Screwtape Letters also contain personal comments on prayer. In my own encounters with Lewis, he never spoke about prayer. I did communicate once with him directly about the daily prayer meetings of the Oxford Intercollegiate Christian Union, where much prayer had been made for the conversion of Sheldon Van Auken, whose wife was active in our prayer group. Indeed, I told Lewis of Sheldon's conversion the day after it happened, but Lewis was never forthcoming about his own prayer life. A shy man, he was all the more sensitive to the Oxford atmosphere then prevailing, that you no more discussed religion too intimately than you talked about your kidneys. So he simply responded positively to Van Auken's news as a confidant who expected it anyway. Lewis suffered enough from the cynical reactions of some of his colleagues when his first religious books were published. For he, an English don, should not be dabbling in theology, much less getting cheap publicity in this way. To trespass into another academic discipline was questionable, to say the least. So Lewis was very careful to introduce his own theological views modestly, though he did have the support of his friend Austin Farrer and other theologians when he did so. In his Reflections on the Psalms, he begins, "I write as one amateur to another, talking about difficulties that I have met, or lights I have gained reading the Psalms, with the hope that this might at any rate interest and sometimes even help other inexpert readers. I am comparing notes, not presuming to instruct. It is only now that some of us have wakened up to the fact that if all of life is carved up among the professions, so that there is likewise no room left for being dilettantes or amateurs in the arts or culture generally, then we shall all be cheated of humanness itself. Lewis got away with it in his day, for when he was questioned about his preaching as a layman at RAF stations during the Battle of Britain, he could genuinely reply he was just doing his war work, like any other old Don who did his duties as an air raid warden, certainly not very trained, but doing his best in an emergency. In such a crisis, there is no need for any further apology than what he writes in the preface to his published BBC talks given during the war, when he first came to public attention. There is no mystery about my position. I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. When I first met him in the 1940s, he looked like Mr. Badger from The Wind in the Willows. Stout, in an old rumpled brown tweed jacket, brown shoes, pipe in mouth, looking like an Oxford farmer. However, once he began to speak, I realized that few people I had ever met, other than perhaps his friend Dyson, could articulate so well, so humorously, and exactly to the point. In this paper, I want to describe 6 traits that I think characterize the personal prayer life of Lewis, and then to look at 3 aspects of his own theological reflections on prayer. 1. The earthy realism of his prayer life. Lewis was no mystic. He admits this several times in his letters. Others might climb daringly in the mountains of mysticism, but he simply slogged around in the foothills. Rather then, his spirituality is earthy, full of realism, for he was dead scared of sentimentalism. It was expressive of a no-nonsense kind of faith. The first poem of his collection, edited after his death, spells out his similar poetic credo. I am so coarse, the things the poets see are obstinately invisible to me. For 20 years I've stared my level best to see if evening, any evening, would suggest a patient etherized upon a table. In vain, I simply wasn't able. To me, each evening looked far more like the departure from a silent yet crowded shore of a ship whose freight with everything, leaving behind gracefully, finally without farewells, marooned mankind. I'm like that odd man Wordsworth knew, to whom a primrose was a yellow primrose, one whose doom keeps him forever in the list of dunces, compelled to live on stock responses, making the poor best that I can of dull things. Lewis is admitting to us all that his spirituality, like his poetry, is prosaic, ordinary, about the world around him. This down-to-earthness about him is perhaps the greatest impression he left upon me. Neo-Platonism was anathema to Lewis, so instead of saying, we must be spiritually regenerated, he confesses, we're like eggs at present, and you can't go on indefinitely being just an ordinary, decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. Thus, his style is vivid, concrete, practical, empty of gas, full of solid stuff. So, too, his faith is all for what he called sound doctrine, not the woolly mindedness of contemporaries he debated with, who wanted, in their words, religion without dogma. Growing up as a child in a low church milieu, he felt later that it did tend to be too, as he put it, cosily living at ease in Zion, not the tough, realistic faith and prayer life Lewis was to develop later. 2. The practical realism of his prayer life. Prayer is not something simply to talk about. It is not even something we do for Lewis. Saying one's prayers was for Lewis only a small part of his experience of prayer. For many years after my conversion, he admits, I never used any ready-made forms except the Lord's Prayer. In fact, I tried to pray without words at all, not to verbalize the mental acts. Even in praying for others, I believe I tended to avoid their names and substituted mental images of them. I still think that the prayer without words is the best, if one can really achieve it. But we have to remember that our exercise of prayer is only effective as we take ourselves as we really are, and not idealize how we would like to be, and thus try and exercise an unrealistic form of expressing prayer. So Lewis had to learn himself that, as he said, to pray successfully without words, one needs to be at the top of one's form. Thinking that we can do always what we can do on occasion is an error that makes our prayers also unrealistic, and this Lewis had to discover, as we all must. The practical rhythm of Lewis was simple enough each day. He would rise at about 7 a.m., take a walk, attend matins at 8 a.m. in the college chapel, breakfast, and start tutorials at 9 a.m. Late in the afternoon, he would make time for prayerful thought and contemplation as he walked around the college grounds. Never would he recommend saying one's prayers last thing at night. No one in his senses, if he has any power of ordering his own day, he said, would reserve his chief prayers for bedtime. Obviously the worst possible hour for any action which needs concentration. My own plan, when hard-pressed, is to seize any time and place, however unsuitable, in preference to the last waking moment. On a day of travelling, I'd rather pray sitting in a crowded train than put it off till midnight, when one reaches a hotel bedroom with aching back and dry throat, and one's mind partly in a stupor and partly in a whirl. In a letter to a friend in 1955, that is to say shortly after he had taken up his professorship at Cambridge, when he used to return home to Oxford at weekends, he said, "Oddly enough, the weekend journeys to and from Cambridge are no trouble at all. I find myself perfectly content in a slow train that crawls through green fields, stopping at every station. Just because the service is so slow and therefore in most people's eyes bad, these trains are almost empty. I get through a lot of reading and sometimes say my prayers. A solitary train journey I find quite excellent for this purpose." All this is consistent with Lewis's earlier observations that much of prayer is really a disposition of heart that is in tune with God's presence in one's life, so that the more our hearts are in tune with and obedient toward God, the less fuss do we need to make about how vocal and articulate we are in saying our prayers. Provided, of course, that we do not succumb to merely having warm feelings or vaguely imaginative thoughts we mistake for real communion with God. This will always demand the most rigorous attentiveness and serious intent to be called real prayer. 3. His natural, simple, unstructured attitude to prayer. As we have noted, Lewis was a private person, concealing his soul in the midst of convivial friendships. He remarked on one occasion that friends are not like lovers who look at each other, but in what they hold in common. So friendships were outward-looking, not introspective for him. Several times he observes the importance of looking at rather than looking through things. So he would never have analyzed his prayer life as we are attempting to do. He would bury us in a loud guffaw of the absurdity of such action. While still agnostic, in October 1929, Lewis read The Diary of an Old Soul by George MacDonald. "He seems to know everything," Lewis confided to Greaves, "and I find my own experience in it constantly." MacDonald wrote, "My surgent thought shoots lark-like up to thee. Thou, like the heaven, art all about the lark. Whatever I surmise or know in me, idea or symbol on the dark, is living, working, thought-creating power in thee, the timeless Father of the hour. I am thy book, thy song, thy child would be. By the following summer term, he had also perused The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence, and Centuries of Meditation by Thomas Traherne. By the following term, he was attending 8 a.m. chapel regularly, but on Christmas Eve 1930, he writes to his friend Greaves, "I think the trouble with me is lack of faith. I have no rational ground for going back on the arguments that convinced me of God's existence. But the irrational deadweight of my old sceptical habits and the spirit of the age and the cares of the day steal away all my lively feelings of the truth. And often, when I pray, I wonder if I am not posting letters to a non-existent address." The reason for the remoteness of Lewis's faith at that time was he was still a deist rather than a Christian. So after a long talk one night with Tolkien and Dyson in July 1931, Lewis wrote to Greaves further, "I have just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. My long talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a great deal to do with it." Later that year, he also read William Law's Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. Lewis was now finding it meaningful to pray for his brother Warren in Shanghai. So he wrote to him at the end of 1931, "When you ask me to pray for you, I don't know if you're serious, but the answer is yes, I do. I may not do you any good, but it does me a lot. For I cannot ask for any change to be made in you without finding that the very same needs to be made in me, which pulls me up also by putting us all in the same boat, checks any tendency to priggishness." All this may seem to be biography about prayer rather than theology, but to Lewis the one was impossible without the other. To look at prayer in detachment from its exercise was inconceivable. And since most of one's existence is usually pretty dull and routine stuff, one's prayers are not exceptional either. Indeed, the more honest we become with ourselves, the more normal our prayer life will be. As Lewis said early on in his BBC talks on Christian morality, at first, Christianity seems to be all about rules and regulations, guilt and virtue, only to find its members are really living in another country. "Everyone is filled full," he went on, "with what we would call goodness, as a mirror is filled with light. But they don't call it goodness. They don't call it anything. They are not thinking of it. They are too busy looking at the source from which it comes." So too, in prayer, Lewis sees that it should become so natural to the believer that we do not make any fuss about it, but simply do it because that is the nature of the Christian life. Speaking about the struggles we may have in prayer, the distractions and dryness in our lives, he comments, "The disquieting thing is not simply that we skimp and begrudge the duty of prayer. The really disquieting thing is that it should have to be numbered among duties at all. For we believe that we were created to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And if the very few minutes we now spend on intercourse with God are a burden to us rather than a delight, what then? If we were perfected, prayer would not be a duty, it would be a delight." Clearly, our sins handicap us from the openness that prayer requires, while the unreality of the unseen realm of prayer only shows how distant we may be from God and His ways. Like friendship with a dear friend, however, prayer is never forced or irksome. It grows as the relationship grows too. 4. Supplicatory prayers for others. Praying for his brother was perhaps the first step that Lewis made in supplication for many other people throughout the rest of his life. In the correspondence to an American lady, begun in October 1950, we read Lewis promising again and again, "I will have you in my prayers," and "Of course we'll help each other in our prayers," and "Let us continue to pray for each other," and "Of course I have been praying for you daily, as always, but latterly have found myself doing so with much more concern." On this last occasion, he narrates an event that was of special circumstance. He had felt one night with strong feeling how good it would be to hear from her with good news. Then, as if by magic, he wrote, indeed it is the whitest magic in the world, the letter comes today. Not, lest I should indulge in folly, that your relief had not occurred before my prayer, but as if, in tenderness for my puny faith, God moved me to pray with special earnestness just before he was going to give me the thing. How true that prayers are his prayers, really. He speaks to himself through us. Lewis was not prepared merely to hold that while petitionary prayer is expressing personal need before God, supplication is praying on behalf of others. Early, he had seen that to supplicate for others, to be changed by prayer, implied the prayer was also willing to see changes in his life as he prayed for others. But petition and supplication are also part of a greater, more mysterious reality of divine soliloquy, since God intends to be not merely all, as pantheism declares, but all in all. If the Holy Spirit is the one who prompts us and gives us the gift of prayer itself, are we not, in our supplications and petitions, actually entering into divine soliloquy, to celebrate the sovereign good that God has intended for all his creatures? So Lewis quotes a poem he found in an old notebook, author unknown, to illustrate this. "They tell me, Lord, that when I seem to be in speech with you, since but one voice is heard, it's all a dream, one talker aping two. Sometimes it is, yet not as they conceive it, rather I seek in myself the things I hope to say, but lo, my springs are dry. Then seeing me empty, you forsake the listener's role, and through my dumb lips breathe, and into utterance wake the thoughts I never knew. And thus you neither need reply nor can. Thus, while we seem two talkers, thou art one forever, and I no dreamer, but thy dream." Dream does suggest pantheism, so Lewis adds, perhaps it is more accurate to call it rather soliloquy. In fact, Lewis sent Bede Griffiths this poem in 1938 to describe the growing convictions of what prayer meant in his life. For this reason, he worked over this poem several times.